All right, so let's talk about this idea of argument mapping and how it's supposed to work, how it's supposed to, um, you know, help us to see what's going on in an argument. So, um, hopefully you guys can see this, mapping arguments. Let me just give you guys some examples of the arguments we had from last class, right? Dogs are friendlier than cats. Dogs are easier to train than cats. Dogs don't require a litter box, therefore dogs are better pets than cats, right? I'm not going to read through the whole argument with all the verbiage. I'm just going to read the distilled version, right? You know, Mapping an argument is a multi-step process. First, you should take a sort of crack at distilling it. Then you should try to diagram it. You might rework the way you've distilled it after you diagram it, but distill, then diagram, right? But we've already done this work of distilling, so no reason to go back and do it again, right? So, dogs friendlier than cats, dogs easier to train than cats, dogs don't require a litter box. I want you guys to notice something. Imagine somebody invented some miraculous way to train cats that only worked for cats but not dogs, and suddenly we've cracked it. We know how to train schmuppers in a way that we don't know how to train Fido, and it's way easier to train a cat than a dog. All right. We can make schmuppers walk on hind legs and jump through hoops, and poor old Rover's just sitting there, right? I don't know what that system would look like, but imagine we have it, right? So we get rid of this claim, well, cats are easier to train than dogs, or dogs are easier to train than cats, since that turns out not to be true in our little imaginary world, right? Well, even so, even if that's true, that we get rid of premise two, if dogs really are friendlier than cats, that gives us some reason to think they're better pets, right? One doesn't require two. One has as much force as it ever had without two. The same goes for three, right? The fact that dogs don't require a litter box always gave us some reason to believe the conclusion is true. It didn't need to or require to in any way, right? Now, we have less support than we used to because two gave us some reason to believe the conclusion all on its own, and now we've gotten rid of it, but that doesn't affect how much power one or three have. Argument B is a different thing. I've relabeled these, right? A planet must be massive enough to clear the neighborhood around its orbit. Pluto isn't massive enough to do that, clear the neighborhood around its orbit. So Pluto's not a planet, right? We should try to indicate our conclusions in some way, so I'll just put so here. Well, look, how's this argument work? I am giving you a standard that a planet must meet, and I'm saying Pluto doesn't satisfy it. These two have to work together to support the conclusion. If I just say a planet must be massive enough to clear the neighborhood around its orbit, that gives you absolutely no reason to think that Pluto isn't a planet, right? We need to know whether Pluto's big enough to do that. Until we do, this standard tells us nothing, right? And if it turned out that Pluto actually was big enough to do that, not only would one not support the conclusion, it would prove the conclusion wrong, right? One needs two to provide any support at all for the conclusion. That is conjoint support, or what you'll sometimes hear called independent support in other books. They need to work together. One with two works together, gives a lot of support for this conclusion. One without two does absolutely nothing to support it. Same with two on its own, right? If we got rid of one, Pluto isn't massive enough to clear the neighborhood around its orbit. Well, what does that have to do with it being a planet, right? That doesn't support three. two needs one, one needs two. They have to work together to give any support for this conclusion. This is what conjoint support means. All right, let's look at a couple more. C just has kind of the same support that one had. Research shows that writing is the best way for students to develop critical thinking. Well, let's say we got rid of two, right? We get rid of this claim students cannot use AI intelligently unless they learn how to write. Let's imagine there's some AI out there that's so idiot-proof that even if you couldn't even write your name, you could somehow use it intelligently, right? Even if that were so, the fact that writing is the best way for students to develop critical thinking skills still gives us some reason to think students shouldn't give up on written assignments, right? These two never required each other. They each provide some support, but they don't need to work together to do it. I want you to notice what's going on with D, though. D is actually more complicated. We'll talk in a little bit about more complicated arguments and diagramming them or mapping them. Sorry, different logic books use different jargon. Mapping is the term I prefer because I think map is, more intuitive, gives us an idea of where we're going. Diagramming, Lavin will also say it's the same basic idea, right? Look, I want you to notice something about this one. There's actually one and two work together, and so do three and four, right? A Lutheran prince and his entourage reported seeing St. Joseph of Cupertino fly. Lutherans are hostile to St. Joseph's Catholic faith and had no reason to lie. Imagine you got rid of two. One would, on its own, give you a very little bit of reason to believe five, right? Somebody reported seeing a miracle. It gives you ever so slight of a reason to think a miracle occurred, right? So it's not the case that conjoint support, the premise provides no support, but it provides a lot more if you know it was a hostile witness, right? You know, if some other brothers from his monastic order reported seeing him fly, you'd be like, I don't know. Or you could even imagine, like let's imagine there's just one of those really shady churches, make up your own name for a shady church. I'll avoid that joke. I'd probably say something bad, right? But they say, well, the Apostle Gary levitates all the time. And it's the Apostle Gary's wife telling you this. And she's like, well, he can't do it around unbelievers. He can only do it around the faithful. But trust me, I've seen him fly, right? She has every reason to lie to you. That would give you no reason to think a miracle occurred, right? The fact that these are hostile witnesses gives you more reason to believe them. It makes the fact that there's a report have a lot more support than it would, right? I mean, look, you don't have to believe this. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Maybe there's some explanation for what these Lutherans claim they saw, but the fact that they're hostile witnesses means there's a lot more support here, right? And look at three and four, right? Catholic Church records miraculous healings every year. Four, they have a strict procedure for winnowing out fraudulent cases. Right? Get rid of four. We just say, well, the Apostle Gary's church records miraculous healings every year. What's their procedure? Well, Gary says he healed somebody. Well, that doesn't prove anything, right? Three, if the Catholic Church really does have a strict and trustworthy procedure, we can debate on whether it does. But if it really does, then three gives more reason than it does on its own. These two work together to give a lot more support than they would on their own. Sometimes with conjoint support, the premises provide no support on their own. Other times it's just that they provide a lot more working together than they otherwise would. Independent support, exactly what it sounds like. Premises on their own give you some reason each of them individually gives you as much reason as it does when you consider it with the others. They don't require each other. Conjoint support, they work together and either provide no support or much less than they would on their own. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you guys, this idea of conjoint versus independent support. Now, next lecture, I will start talking about, well, we've got this concept. How do we map the arguments? And I'll start doing that next lecture. I will map these arguments. Now, one thing I want to say about conjoint support, just before I end, is that usually, maybe not usually, but a lot of the times it'll be two premises work together to provide conjoint support, but it can be more. Let me give you guys an example. I'll just use an example from Clue, right? We played a lot of, when I was a kid, the power went out a lot. We lived in the middle of nowhere. We got a lot of snow and ice, a lot of days where the power was out. And we had a Coleman lantern and a lot of time to kill, right? So let's use an example from Clue. Say we know that the murderer is one of these three suspects: Reverend Green, Mrs. Scarlet, or Professor Plum committed the murder. Wasn't Scarlet, wasn't Plum, wasn't Scarlet, so it's Green, right? Now we can just number these. If these are true, you know, Reverend Green, Scarlet, or Plum did it. Wasn't Scarlet, wasn't Plum, so it's Green. Well, that if these are all true, that would really show that it definitely is the Reverend that did it. So, but if we got rid of any of them, then we wouldn't know it was the Reverend. We need to know that it's one of the three and the other two didn't do it, right? So here we have three premises that all work together to prove this conclusion. Theoretically, you could have as many as you want that all require each other. I could add three more names here. You'd have to have three premises eliminating each of those guys, right? So just keep that in mind. Conjoint support, often it's two premises working together. It can be more. Theoretically, there's no upper limit. Although, I don't think we're going to see any argument where there's seven. And that's just pretty rare anyway. Okay. So I will stop there. And in our next lecture, we will start talking about, well, how exactly do you map arguments?